Welcome to the 2021 Annual Ethics Training for the Tennessee House of Representatives, presented by the Tennessee Bureau of Ethics and Campaign Finance. I'm Doug Himes, your House Ethics Counsel. This year's training format is a little different from years past, but I think it will be just as informative and enjoyable. After viewing the program, don't forget to fill out the training certification form and return it to me. We are very fortunate to have as your presenters today Mr. Bill Young, Executive Director of the Bureau of Ethics and Campaign Finance, Ms. Lauren Topping, the Bureau's General Counsel, and Mr. Lance Frizzell, the Bureau's Assistant Director. Director Young.
I appreciate that kind introduction by Doug Himes, the Chief Ethics Officer of the House. As many of you know, Doug and I work closely together on all the issues we face, and that's important that we work together not only with Doug, but also Russell Humphreys, his counterpart in the Senate, and we have a good working relationship with both of them. We're here today for your annual ethics training. As Doug mentioned, I want to say good morning to Speaker Sexton and to members of the House who will be viewing this presentation. We appreciate your being here. We know that you're required by law to be here. The General Assembly is required by statute that all of you have annual ethics training, and this is your ethics training for 2021. It's a little different than it has been in the past. Usually I would be sitting in the House chambers along with Lauren Topping, our General Counsel, who's here with me to my left, and we would be providing this presentation to you in person. But because of the COVID-19 containment efforts, we're doing this by video, and we're happy to do so, and we hope it works out well for you. As I just mentioned, I have our General Counsel from the Bureau of Ethics and Campaign Finance to my left, Lauren Topping. She's going to be assisting me with this presentation. And we have off camera our Assistant Director, Lance Frizzell. As we get through the presentation, Director Frizzell is going to ask us questions, and we're going to respond to those questions to kind of have a give and take. As you know, that kind of give and take is required by the statute you passed. So we're going to be doing that as well. It is a pleasure again to be with you here today, although I wish the circumstances were different. We've had a very difficult 2020 and a rough start to 2021. As you know, almost a year ago now, we entered into the COVID-19 pandemic, and we are still struggling with that today. We're all hopeful that the vaccine is quickly and efficiently distributed, and hopefully we can get back to normal sometime in the near future. But it's been a tough year and a tough start to 2021, still dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. We've also had riots in our major cities. We had destruction to the Metro Courthouse here in Nashville, and most recently we had destruction to the U.S. Capitol, things that we haven't seen in our lifetime happen, and there was a very disturbing events that are going on throughout our country. We also had the bombing on Christmas Day here in Nashville that destroyed a portion of Nashville's historic district on 2nd Avenue. And finally, we start 2021 with the Federal Bureau of Investigation raiding offices here in this building on Cordell Hall. Disappointing start to 2021, to say the least. I know I talked to my mother, and by the way, Deputy Speaker Chris Johnson, when you see this, you know my mother. You know her very well, and I talked to her just last night, and she expressed again, and every time I talk to her, she expresses this concern about where the country is going. She's 85 years old, and she thinks the country is in the worst shape as she's seen. And remember, she's lived through the Depression, through World War II, through the demonstrations in the 1960s, and she's more worried about our country's future today than she ever was. But I told her, and I will tell you, that I am confident we're going to get through these problems. We're going to emerge united, as we always do, and confront the problems we face. We're going to get through this pandemic. We're going to get through the problems, disturbances in the street, and we're going to come out stronger than we ever have. So with that bit of optimism to start our presentation, we'll delve into the ethics presentation today and get going with it. You're going to notice I may been down here. I've got some cheat notes in front of me that I'm going to rely on. So when you see me looking down, that's what I'm looking at. Again, as I stated, I'm here today for your annual ethics training as required by you, the General Assembly, of the members of the General Assembly. We're going to be focusing on campaign finance, which General Topping is going to deal with, and also the Ethics Commission, which I'm going to address. Those are the topics we're dealing with. You have materials that have been delivered to you, 2 sets of materials. You have a PowerPoint that I prepare. I deliver this PowerPoint to lots of people, including you. But it goes through the various responsibilities of the Bureau of Ethics and Campaign Finance. It's a long PowerPoint, but it's very detailed and gives you a lot of information about what we do. You also have the General Assembly training materials, which is a little different because it's actually got a compilation of the statutes we operate under, the rules and regulations we operate under, and a question and answer session that deals with the exceptions to prohibited gifts by lobbyists and employers of lobbyists. A lot of you have a lot of questions around whether a particular gift is prohibited or not. Maybe it falls within one of those exceptions. And those questions, which I give Doug Himes a lot of credit for developing when he was with us, are very helpful in helping you walk through that process. So pay attention to those questions and the answers to those questions. A little bit about who we personally are. I'm going to start with the lady to my left, Lauren Topping. She is our general counsel. She came over after I was retained. I hired her from the Secretary of State's office, where she worked with their general counsel and with Secretary Trey Hargett. I want to say I greatly appreciate Secretary Hargett giving up Lauren Topping to allow her to come over and do our legal work at the Bureau of Ethics and Campaign Finance. She's been a real find. Also off camera, we have Assistant Director Lance Forsell. Many of you know Lance from his days as Chief of Staff for Lieutenant Governor Ron Ramsey. I got to know him when he was in that position. He knows Capitol Hill, he knows the folks around here, and he's been an invaluable acquisition to our office. And finally, we've got the staff that my predecessor Drew Rollins had in place. They're always willing to answer your questions. We encourage people to call us. Let us know if you've got any questions. We want to keep you out of trouble and us out of trouble, and the best way we do that is by answering any questions you have about compliance with either the campaign finance statutes or the ethics requirements. So a little bit about my background, and many of you know me. You've known me from my work over at the Tennessee Attorney General's office. I'm an attorney by trade. I hate to say it, but almost 40 years of practice in the legal field. I spent a lot of time with the Tennessee Attorney General's office. Again, that's where a lot of you know me from. I also spent 10 years with Blue Cross Blue Shield of Tennessee down in Chattanooga as their General Counsel Chief Compliance Officer. And finally, I was Deputy Commissioner over at Tennessee Commerce and Insurance. So the interesting thing about me is I'm one of those rare individuals that serve both in the judicial branch, the legislative branch, and the executive branch. So hopefully I'm familiar with how government works here in Tennessee. And that's briefly my background. And again, many of you know me from past history. This year, we intend to hit the highlights of the program. And again, it's a little different environment. Usually I'd have you in front of me asking questions. That's not going to happen this year. But we're going to hit the highlights. We're going to focus in on campaign finance and ethics. And we're going to leave time for Assistant Director Forsell to hit us with questions. And hopefully we're going to know the answers to those questions. If we don't, we're going to pause this tape and get the answers for you. So here we go. What is the Bureau's purpose? Why did the General Assembly, why did you create the Bureau of Ethics Campaign Finance? And it is quite simple, and I pull this from the PowerPoint. It's to sustain the public's confidence in government by increasing the integrity and transparency of state and local government through regulation of lobbying activities, financial disclosure requirements, campaign finance, and ethical conduct. The key word there is transparency. We, on our website, are providing information to the public and to the press about what campaign contributions are being made, what possible conflicts of interest you or as public officials may have through your filing of statements of interest, who our lobbyists are, who our political action committees are, what contributions they're making, what expenditures making. All of that information is available on our website, open to public review. So the public understands where the money is coming from and where the money is going in campaign finance and what potential conflicts of interest public officials and candidates for office have. I have a quote in here from Adlai Stevenson. I think it's a great quote, particularly in these times. Public confidence in the integrity of the government is indispensable to faith in democracy. And when we lose faith in the system, we have lost faith in everything we fight and spend for. So our job is to promote public confidence in not only what you as state officials are doing, but also in our local officials. We work with our local officials closely on ethics matters. How did we get here? Why was the Bureau of Ethics and Campaign Finance set up? And I went into this history last year with you, and I'm going to go into it again because I think it's particularly relevant for us to understand how we got to where we are today. There were a series of scandals that led to the creation of the Bureau of the Ethics Commission and to the strengthening of the ethics laws in Tennessee. First, and I'm old enough to remember this, was the Ray Blatton pardons and paroles scandal. As many of you recall, Governor Blatton was accused, and some of those around him were accused, of selling pardons and paroles to the highest bidder. In fact, the scandal was so bad that Lamar Alexander, who was the incoming governor, was sworn in early in order to prevent any further scandal in the pardons and paroles area. And that happened in the 1970s, and I can remember it. I was actually in high school and college then. And then we fast track into the about 1984 to 1989, and we have what's called the Rocky Top investigation. And the members of the press, they label these investigations. They come up with very interesting names. What did Rocky Top involve? It involved illegal activity around charity bingo. At that time, charity bingo was a legal activity in Tennessee. You could get a license to operate a charitable bingo operation. Unfortunately, the allegation, and in fact it was subsequently proved, many of these licenses were being sold to the highest bidder and they weren't being sold for charitable purposes. Ultimately, the investigation revealed that many of these so-called charities, 99% of the money they were taking in from bingo operations were going to some purpose other than a charitable purpose. Governor McNally, our lieutenant governor in the Senate, was in the House at the time, and he actually wore a wire at the request of the TBI and the FBI in this matter. A very brave and courageous stand by him to ensure that any problems were identified and they were dealt with. And he can still give you a lot of details about that. And I read that he was actually offered a bribe himself while he was wearing that wire. What happened in that? As a result of that investigation, we had 50 convictions, including a conviction of the House Majority Leader at the time, Tommy Burnett. We had two individuals, the Secretary of State, Gentry Crowell, and Ted Ray Miller, who was a legislator, who committed suicide when they received subpoenas to testify about this matter. It's a very deep scandal for the state of Tennessee. And so then we move up a few years later and we get to what's called the Tennessee Waltz. This occurred in 2002, 2008. Actually, I was a racial lobbyist during this time. We had undercover TBI, FBI agents who were offering legislators bribes in order to vote for legislation to help the company, the fictitious company that they had created, sell the votes for legislation. That's what it was all about. They went undercover, and unfortunately, they found legislators who were willing to take money to sell their votes. Ultimately, they paid out $150,000 in bribes. About 7 legislators were convicted as a result of this investigation. 2 county commissioners were convicted. It was at that time the General Assembly said enough is enough, and they created the Ethics Commission. They overhauled the ethics statutes in this state, And they said, never more are we going to have these problems. And that's the purpose of the Ethics Commission and the ethics laws. It's also why you have your own ethics officers to deal with these issues. Not to say these issues will not arise again, but that we have a mechanism in place to deal with them. And it will deal with them at the end of the day. So what is the Bureau? How does the Bureau work? As I said, the Bureau deals with campaign finance and also ethics. We actually have two boards. There are 12 members of the Bureau that act as a single Bureau, but really composed of two boards. First, we have the Ethics Commission, which is composed of 6 members. Interestingly enough, each member is, we have 2 members selected by the governor, 2 members selected by the Speaker of the House, 2 members by the Speaker of the Senate. And they are required to be equally divided between Democrat representatives and Republican representatives. So we have a 3-3 partisan division on the Ethics Commission, at least in the selection process. The same is true of the Treasury Board, which deals with campaign finance. The members selected 2 by the governor, 2 by the Speaker of the Senate, 2 by the Speaker of the House. But the mechanism requires that half be Democrats and half be Republicans. And again, that's to ensure that there's no partisan swing to either one of these boards at the end of the day. Again, the reason we have this is transparency, both in ethics and campaign finance. At this time, I'm going to hand it, we're going to talk a little bit about campaign finance, and that's why this lady is to my left. She's going to handle the campaign finance part of this presentation, and I'm going to return to you for the Ethics Commission presentation after giving you a little background and history of why we're here. So with that, Lauren, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk about campaign finance. Go ahead.
Great, thank you very much. So as you're all aware, state law requires that candidates for the General Assembly as well as elected members file campaign finance disclosures periodically. For those of you that were up for re-election in 2020, the 4th quarter report was just recently due on January the 25th. So get that in as soon as you can if you haven't already. The next report that you'll need to be aware of will be the mid-year supplemental report, which won't actually be due until July the 15th of this year. So you have plenty of time on that one. PACs are also on this same schedule. They have a 4th quarter report and then the mid-year report in July. For those of you who are not up for re-election or election in 2020, the next report that you will need to file will be the year-end supplemental report, which is actually going to be due in a few days on February the 1st. So getting into what the reporting requirements actually are, on each of these reports, you're required to disclose all contributions received and all expenditures, including in-kind contributions. In-kind contributions are those where someone pays for a service or a product on your behalf, and you don't yourself actually pay for it. Failure to file these reports in a timely manner can result in civil penalties up to $10,000. And if you are assessed a civil penalty and fail to pay it and file the report, you can also be prevented from qualifying in any future election for your position. You must continue to file all of these reports until you have a $0 balance on hand, a 0 loan balance, and a 0 obligation balance on your account. So if for some reason any of you are not seeking re-election and are looking to close your account in the coming months, remember that there is only a limited number of acceptable uses for unexpended campaign funds. So if you have that looking in the future, please come talk to us about how we can help you deal with any funds you may have left over. When you are reporting contributions, these can be reported either by unitemized contributions or itemized contributions. However, contributions cannot be made anonymously, so that is important. For contributions from any single contributor in excess of $100 per cycle, these must be reported itemized, and additional contributor data is also going to be required to be provided on the report. Also, cash contributions from any contributor may not exceed $50 per cycle. I next want to talk about personal use of campaign funds. Personal use of campaign funds is not permitted for any reason. This rule does not apply to PACs, but keep in mind that a PAC cannot make an in-kind contribution to a candidate for that candidate's own personal use. Examples of prohibited personal uses are laid out in the statute that you all have passed, but the list is not exclusive. So if you have any questions about that, please come talk to us about it, and we'll be able to assist you in determining whether or not your expenditure is appropriate. Violation of this rule is subject to the assessment of a civil penalty by the Registry Board in up to $10,000 per violation. Also want to talk about per diem rates. On a day that a member is receiving per diem, that member may not use campaign funds to pay for office holder expenses or any expenses that are not directly campaign related. And this includes lodging and meals for themselves as well as any other member. Costs for meals and lodging expenses in excess of the per diem amounts are considered personal expenses, and therefore they are not office holder expenses or permissible campaign expenses. Let's talk about fundraising really quickly. Members are not permitted to raise funds or accept contributions during legislative session, subject to some very specific and narrow exceptions. For most of you, this means that you may begin accepting contributions on the earlier of either the end of session or June the 1st. Also want to talk about this blackout period. For those of you who may receive checks that were written to you before legislative session began, since we're still a little bit close to when session began. This year we have provided the guidance to all of the members that contributions which are made and postmarked prior to the date of the beginning of legislative session may be received by the member and deposited into the member's campaign account after the start of legislative session. If this occurs, you should make every effort to deposit the contribution as quickly as possible after you receive it, and we also encourage you to maintain a copy of the envelope that you received that check in so that you can substantiate the date of postmark in which the contribution was sent to you. If you did not receive that contribution by mail, but for some reason received a check just before the start of session in hand, you can also go ahead and deposit those checks as well. But we do encourage you to go ahead and get it in as quickly as possible and to try to document as best you can when you actually received that so that we can know that you did receive it before the beginning of the legislative session. Lastly, I want to talk really quickly about contribution limits. As you know, there are limits on how much money you are allowed to accept from individuals as well as from PACs, and then there are greater aggregate limits. I won't go through all of the limits here, but just know that these limits have gone up for the next cycle, and the new numbers are now available on our website for your review. For example, the individual contribution limit is the only contribution limit that did not increase this year. So from an individual, the most you can accept in this upcoming cycle will still be $1,600. However, the amount that you can accept from PACs has gone up to $12,700. So again, like I said, these numbers have changed, so we encourage you to go on our website and familiarize yourself with those in advance before you begin accepting contributions for the next year. Beyond that, we're always here to help you determine how you need to report something, whether or not something is reportable. If you feel like you have a question about whether or not it should be reported, a good general rule of thumb is that you should always disclose it. And then we can help you determine how it should be disclosed and what information needs to be entered on your disclosure report if you have those questions. So please feel free to give us a call at any time to work through those issues. But that's all I have on campaign finance today.
Thank you, Lauren. And again, I want to emphasize, and you're going to hear it more than once in this presentation, if you've got a problem, if you've got a question, don't guess, call. And I want to commend the members of the House because a lot of you do call. I know William Lamberth, anytime, I've gotten calls from Caucus Chair Lamberth over the weekend. He calls me and I tell him that's no problem. If you need help over the weekend, please give me a call. I got a text from one of our local judges this weekend who's having trouble with his statement of interest. We want to be available for you. We want to make sure you have answers to your questions, and we want to make sure that whatever documents you're filing with us, whether it's a campaign financial statement, a statement of interest, or anything else, that is filed correctly and that you get the information you need. We've got great staff. They know the answers to your question. If they don't, they'll come to me or Lance and we'll figure them out. So please contact us. The other thing I would encourage you to do is document on campaign finance. You're required by statute, by your statute, to maintain documents for 2 years after any election. Make sure you retain those documents and that you get the right documents to evidence that your campaign financial statement is filed correctly. It's important you have those documents in case any question arises from any member of the public or if you are the subject of an audit. Remember, we are required to do audits of legislators as well as lobbyists every year. So we have those drawings. If your name is drawn out of the hat, we will be calling you to do an audit of your campaign finance statements, and we'll be relying on the documents you're keeping. I want to spend some time now talking about the Tennessee Ethics Commission. Last year, we spent most of the time in this presentation talking about campaign finance because of the many questions we had. And we didn't spend as much time talking about the Ethics Commission. One thing you need to know about the Ethics Commission is they're not the sole source of regulation of ethics in state government. As you know, each body of the General Assembly, the House and Senate, have their own House ethics officers. Doug Himes is the House ethics officer. Russell Humphrey is the Senate ethics officer. You have your own internal rules that deal with the ethics of members of the General Assembly. You have committees to deal with any violations of those rules. So your body has a deep commitment to ensure ethics in government and to take action when there's any ethical problem with any particular member. And we work closely with your ethics officers in that area. We also, you should note, we had that the executive branch has its own ethics officer, Lang Wiseman, the general counsel, under Governor Lee's Executive Order 2. This is a carryover of what Governor Haslam had done. He had a similar type executive order that created perhaps even tighter ethical standards for executive level employees. So when you're, as an executive level official, when you're looking at your ethical responsibilities, you need not only to look at our statutes that regulate executive branch conduct, but you also need to look at Executive Order 2. And when we get any questions regarding Executive Order 2, we refer those to Lang Wiseman, the Governor's General Counsel, Chief Ethics Officer, and we work closely with Lang in dealing with any questions that come up regarding the executive branch. You also have ethics separately set by the judicial branch, by the Tennessee Supreme Court, not only for lawyers, but also for judges. And those ethics requirements are set forth in Tennessee Supreme Court Rules 7, 8, and 9. And finally, the General Assembly has passed a statute, it's in your materials, requiring every local government in this state to adopt an ethics code of conduct. And that code of conduct is to be administered and regulated by an official within that local government. That's required by statute. Indeed, it's also required that those code of conducts be sent to the Ethics Commission and for us to publish those codes of conduct on our website. And they're available for every county, municipality in this state. We've got those available online, and we try to work closely with the local governments in the regulation of ethics. The General Assembly, in its wisdom, basically said the Ethics Commission is dealing with state officials in the regulation of ethics. For local officials, those are best dealt with at the local level, and that's what those statutes require. So be aware if it's a local issue, a local ethical issue, that the remedy is not through the Ethics Commission. The remedy is through that local body, through that officer that has been appointed by the local body to investigate and deal with any ethics issues that come up concerning a local official. So what does the Ethics Commission specifically do? As I just mentioned, its jurisdiction is primarily limited to activities of state officials, members of the General Assembly, executive branch employees, and other state employees. The Ethics Commission has the authority to issue both informal and formal advisory opinions. There are a number of formal advisory opinions that have been issued by the Ethics Commission, but for whatever reason, we haven't had any formal advisory opinions issued probably in 10 years. Instead, we've gone to issuing more informal advisory opinions, and we're required at the Ethics Commission to catalog those. Our general counsel and I have been in the process of collecting those, and we have a lot of them. We have a lot of questions around lobbyists, lobbyist registration, particularly prohibited gifts, and every time we give an informal answer to those questions, we're required to keep a copy of that and to provide a copy of it to the Ethics Commission. And we've probably had, since my tenure, which has been over a year now, over 100, maybe even 200 informal advisory opinions, basically answers to questions sent to us by email, that we have issued. The Ethics Commission also has the authority to hear sworn complaints initiated by a Tennessee citizen regarding an ethical breach by a state official. Those complaints are required to be sworn. They are required to be kept, initially at least, confidential. The way it works, when we receive a sworn complaint, the Ethics Commission considers that in executive session, again, it's confidential, to determine whether grounds exist to refer the matter for investigation. And by statute, that investigation is done by the State Attorney General's office. So at the preliminary stage, the question is, do we have jurisdiction to hear it? And if we do, we refer it to investigation by the Attorney General. The next stage is once that investigation is complete, it'll come back to the Ethics Commission for determination of whether probable cause exists to set a show cause hearing to determine whether there's been an ethical violation. If the Ethics Commission finds probable cause exists, then that becomes a public hearing. At that point, the confidentiality provision ceases. There's a public hearing that involves both the complainant and the respondent, and the Ethics Commission actually holds a hearing. The next thing that the Ethics Commission does is it regulates lobbyists. Lobbyists are required to register with the Ethics Commission, as well as employers of lobbyists. And we're required to provide training to those lobbyists, assess fees to those lobbyists for their activity in Tennessee, and also interpret and deal with the laws regarding the registration of a lobbyist and lobbyist activities. We have a lot of questions regarding what is quote-unquote lobbying and what is not. Several of the informal advisory opinions have dealt with those issues. We also regulate the statements of interest. There's a large plethora of state and local officials that are required to file statements of interest with the Ethics Commission. Most officials are required to file those by January 31. So right now, we are getting a ton of statements of interest that are being filed with the Ethics Commission. There are annual filings. They are intended to list information about either a candidate or a local official or state official. And there, in your presentation, you have the questions that you're required to fill out, including income, your positions, certain types of investments. Again, the purpose of these, we put them on our website, is that the public and the press and others can know what potential conflicts of interest may be there, either for a candidate for office or for a current office holder. I said we're getting a lot of those filed on January 31, but you, as members of the General Assembly, actually file yours on April 15th, as well as certain members of the executive branch are required to file on April 15th. You also have more rigorous standards, reporting requirements than certain other officials. But those take up a lot of time. We have a lady in our office who deals primarily, or her time is taken up entirely dealing with statements of interest, making sure they're properly filed, they're properly placed on our website, that if we have any official not filing, that's the Ethics Commission is notified, and they're authorized to assess civil penalties against anyone who doesn't file or files late. That's a lot of their agenda when they meet, is dealing with folks who haven't filed the statements of interest. You ask, how do we know who the local officials are? Well, every local election commission is required to give us a list not only of all local office holders who fall under the Statement of Interest statute, but any candidates. And candidates have to file statements of interest. You'll be surprised to know perhaps that local planning commissioners have to file statements of interest with us. Executive committee members of either the Republican or Democratic Party, because they are elected, have to file a statement of interest with our office. So you as the General Assembly have created a long list of folks who are required to file those statements of interest, again, for the purpose of transparency, so that the public and the press can identify what interest they represent, what possible conflicts of interest they have in either running for office or holding office. Finally, the Ethics Commission also is required to draft guiding principles of ethical conduct for public officials. That document is on our website. We're actually looking to update that document to see if we need to add more to it. A lot of that document comes from the Senate and House ethics rules themselves. You'll see some of those repeated in that document that the Ethics Commission has done. What else does the Ethics Commission do? It does a lot of training, like the training you're getting here today that we're required to do every year. I, as a lawyer, am required every year to have 15 hours of continuing legal education requirements. You, as a member of the General Assembly, are required to attend this training course every year on your ethical obligations. Interestingly enough, on my continuing legal education requirements as a lawyer, the Supreme Court requires that 3 of those 15 hours be devoted to ethics. So ethics training, both for lawyers and public officials, is very important. So we all know what the lines are. We all know what our responsibilities and duties are, and as those evolve and change, that you're advised of those changes so you can comply with the ethical requirements of your office. We also provide annual orientation ethics course to supervisory personnel in the executive branch. I know Director Frizzell is working on that now, making sure that that training is completed. Again, that training occurs every year, and we're required to track it, make sure every member of the executive branch that's required by statute to take that training actually takes it. We also give an annual ethics course for lobbyists and employers of lobbyists. Indeed, when we meet in person, like we did last year, you'll see a lot of lobbyists sitting in the audience taking your training because they can get credit for it as their training. Unfortunately, this year they're going to have to do the online training like you're doing, and won't be able to attend the House chamber and get credit for it. We also do required training for our own Bureau members, not only the Ethics Commission members, but also the Registry Board members. Before they can even sit in a meeting, they're required to have training from the Attorney General's office about their duties and responsibilities, and that is required to be verified and evidenced. So again, the Ethics Commission, through its training and tracking, is doing a lot to ensure that the ethics laws of the state, the guiding principles of ethical conduct, are being followed. We talked some about the disclosure statements. I'm not going to go much more into that. I would note for you that there's a prohibition in the state statute, and again, this comes under the Ethics Commission jurisdiction, on consulting services for compensation by members of the General Assembly. Pay attention to the definition of consulting services in that statute because it's relatively narrow. It means that you cannot be paid as a General Assembly member to either promote legislation before the General Assembly, that seems to make some sense, or to promote or advance any contract with the state of Tennessee. Again, that makes some sense. Note that that's also a criminal violation. So you do not want to ever run afoul of that consulting services statute. The Ethics Commission also regulates under the lobbyist, employer of lobbyist umbrella, the provision of state statute that generally prohibits gifts being given by lobbyists or employers of lobbyists to members of the General Assembly or executive officials. Now, remember, the general rule is that a lobbyist or employer of lobbyists cannot give a gift to you as a member of the General Assembly. There are, however, a number of exceptions in that statute. And we have a lot of questions that come up from lobbyists, employers of lobbyists, from you as members of the General Assembly or members of the executive branch on whether those exceptions apply. There's a personal friendship exception, and you have in the materials a laundry list of what you need to look at to see if you come within that exception. But I would tell you that it's sort of like Justice Stewart on the U.S. Supreme Court said about pornography. It's kind of, you know it when you see it. You know whether you've got a personal friendship with a person or not. You know what that entails, and it's kind of a common sense denomination. You can also take informational materials from lobbyists. A lot of lobbyists will send you packets of materials to educate you about what their client is doing. That's okay to take those. They can even send them by electronic means. As long as it's informational, as long as it's intended to educate you, that would fall within the exception. And I know Doug Himes and I are working on the exception. If you're offered travel and certain other expenses by a recognized governmental entity to come speak to that entity or to attend a conference, that's an exception. And we're trying to get together a list. It won't be an all-inclusive list, but at least it will give you a list. And Doug actually has that list, if you ever need it, of organizations that fall within that definition. One other one that's come up, and I'm going to briefly mention, there's an exemption for certain charitable events if the ticket or is purchased by an employer of a lobbyist. You have to watch this one because it says employer of lobbyists, not lobbyist. Lobbyists can't give you this, but an employer of lobbyists could. They can invite you to a charitable event as long as you're not receiving a benefit that's not that is generally available to the public. So, for instance, if an employer of a lobbyist invites you to attend a golf event and other folks are invited to attend and play golf, that's okay. What would not be okay is if they gave you a nice set of golf clubs that they weren't given to anyone else other than you as a member of the General Assembly. So that's a tough exception to follow because it's got so many caveats to it. But again, if you have any questions regarding that, please let us know. Also note that the gift prohibition only applies to lobbyists or employers of lobbyists. So if the person giving you a gift is not a lobbyist or an employer of a lobbyist, it's okay. The exception doesn't apply to others, except, and actually Director Forcell might get into this in his questions, there are certain high-level positions within the employer of a lobbyist that are included within the definition of employer of a lobbyist. For instance, the CEO of a company is considered an employer of a lobbyist. So be careful there. The CEO couldn't give you a gift either because that person is included within the definition of employer of a lobbyist. Again, we get a lot of questions around gifts and gift prohibitions. One trap for the unwary, be aware of, there's a separate statute that absolutely prohibits cash or cash equivalent honorariums to be taken by you when you're delivering a speech or a talk in your position as a member of the General Assembly. So if you're invited by a local Rotary Club to go talk to them and you're there in your official capacity to talk about what you're doing up here at the General Assembly, and they try to give you a Cracker Barrel gift card, even if it's just $10, you cannot take it by statute. Now, you can take a pencil or a pen or a token of appreciation, but you can't take anything that's cash or cash equivalent for speech. And that's a separate statute. It's not in the gift statute. It's elsewhere in the code, but be aware of it. We've had that come up several times where legislator will show up and you know, we're all Tennesseans, we're all generous folks. If someone shows up for a meeting of my club, I want to give them a little gift card to show how much we appreciate them coming. Be aware you can't take that and tell them it's not your fault, it's this state law that's causing you the problem there. A couple of recent developments, and then I'm going to open it up for questions that you need to be aware of. Remember, we had litigation that was commenced a couple of years back on what was a statute that the General Assembly had passed called the PAC, Political Action Committee Blackout Statute. What that statute said is that 10 days before any election, a PAC could not give money to any candidate. That statute was challenged in the Chancery Court here in Davidson County. Ultimately, the Chancery Court held the statute unconstitutional. The Tennessee Court of Appeals affirmed that holding, and there was no appeal beyond that. So that 10-day blackout period for PACs has been held invalid. It's still on the books, but it can't be enforced. Just be aware that, and we still get questions about it because people ask about it, that it's invalid. PACs can continue to give right up to the date of election. Included within that challenge was a challenge to the registration fee that PACs were required to file. Each PAC is required to pay a $100 registration fee every year to the Ethics Commission to offset our cost. That statute was also declared invalid by the Chancery Court, but the statute was amended in the course of the litigation, and the Court of Appeals said the statute is amended. It wasn't going to address it. And the Chancery Court didn't address it when it was remanded back down. So that statute is amended. We consider valid, and we have begun collecting the registration fees for PACs in 2021. Unfortunately for us, we understand that there is soon going to be a pending challenge to even that statute, perhaps filed in the Chancery Court here in Davidson County. So stay tuned on that account. Finally, one other recent development, just for your information, we had a question come before the Registry Board on the settlement of a civil penalty for a candidate who was running for the House of Representatives. And I won't get into any names. I suspect all of you know who it is. But in any event, the settlement came to us within the day before qualifying deadline. And as you know, the statute says if you have outstanding civil penalties assessed by the Registry Board because you haven't timely filed or have improperly filed your campaign finance statement, you're disqualified from running for office in Tennessee. Well, this individual offered us a settlement offer the night before the qualifying deadline. So we needed to determine whether that was going to be accepted or not. It would determine whether that individual could run for office. So on the advice of the Attorney General, we convened the Ethics Commission real quickly by phone, by email, did an email vote, and they, by 4-2 vote, accepted the settlement, allowed the individual to run. Subsequently, the Registry Board was sued, claiming that sort of meeting violated the Open Meetings Act. And even though the Registry Board ultimately reaffirmed what it had done in a subsequent meeting, the Chancery Court did determine that did violate the Open Meetings Act. I still am concerned about that decision, but it is the law because all the Registry Board was doing was determining the legal question of whether to accept a settlement or not. I would have thought that might have been confidential under attorney-client privilege, would have been dealt with in executive session anyway, but that's not what the Chancellor found. So anytime we're making a decision to settle a matter, we're going to have an open meeting now. That's the law, and we're certainly going to comply with that law. So those are recent developments. At this point, I have gotten through, there's a lot more material out there that we could spend even more time on, but we only have an hour, and I want to get to the question and answer part of this because I think it's the most informative part of this presentation, actually. And Director Fursell, even though he's off camera, he's going to be kind of like the voice coming in here with these questions. And we're going to repeat the questions for you so you make sure you hear them. But he's kind of, I'm sure he's going to enjoy this. It's like a voice on high coming in. His face won't be here, but you'll hear his voice, kind of like an episode of Star Wars or something. But anyway, Director Fursell, why don't you shoot us your first question?
May a legislator use a candidate campaign account or leadership PAC account to pay for the lease of an apartment in non-session months?
Thank you, Director Fursell, for that question. First, the reason for the question, and this came up in our presentation to the Senate this year, is that many members will rent an apartment for the entire year in order to save money on their per diem and on their lease. They can get a better deal if they do a year lease, a half-year lease, than renting a hotel for a day while session is going on. So the question arose, could I use my campaign account to pay for those off-session months? And the answer to that question, quite simply, is no. The campaign account, as we've previously stated, can only be used for campaign activity or for in the furtherance of your office. We determined after much thought that when you're not in session, you're not required to be in Nashville, then you couldn't use campaign funds in furtherance of office holder duties, quite simply because you're not required to be here. The next part of that question is, well, could I use leadership PAC funds if I have a leadership PAC funds? And the answer to that question is also no. If you look at the rules that the Bureau has enacted, the rules basically say that you cannot use a PAC that is controlled by a candidate to pay for the personal expenses of a candidate. Given we've already determined that the payment of these lease amounts would be a personal expense, not campaign related, not office holder related, you couldn't circumvent those restrictions through the use of a PAC controlled by the candidate. So you couldn't, and the other problem would be that it would be considered an in-kind contribution in any event to the candidate, becomes part of the campaign fund, and therefore is subject to the same restrictions as a campaign account is.
Can a legislator deposit a contribution after the session starts if the contribution was received prior to session?
Okay, so yes, we talked about this a little bit earlier in the presentation, but I want to touch on it, but we'll touch on it again now. So the answer to the question is yes. Contributions which are made and postmarked, now the postmark date is important in this scenario, but if they're made and postmarked prior to the start of the legislative session, then you may, and then you receive that by mail after the session begins, you may deposit that into your campaign account and accept that contribution. So in the event that you receive a check, to know whether or not you can accept that contribution, you want to know if the check was dated prior to the beginning of session and whether or not it was postmarked prior to the beginning of session. If both of those are the case, then yes, you can keep that and you can deposit it. And we would encourage you to go ahead and keep copies of the check, of the envelope, anything that you can to document those two pieces of information. And that way we will know down the line if a complaint is ever raised or anything like that, that you did in fact receive that and follow the guidance there. As for how you would report that, this year we're giving the guidance that you would report that contribution as of the date of the postmark, which again is another reason to really keep a copy of that envelope so that you can substantiate that date. In general, as you all know, contributions are reported as received on the date that you actually have them in hand. But to cut down on confusion and any possibility that there may be questions raised about violations of this law, we have given that guidance that you can use the postmark in this specific situation to make things easier on everyone. And it also kind of applies also in the scenario where if someone hands you a check just before the start of session, yes, you can go ahead and accept that check and deposit the funds. We would encourage you to do it quickly. Don't put it in your desk and forget about it. But to go ahead and deposit those funds and try to document it as best you can. If you can write a memo to your files, or if you can get a receipt from the person who gave it to you, anything like that you can, just to document that it was in fact received prior to the start of legislative session. And again, when you report it, you would report it as on the date that you received it. So that would be the start prior to the start of session. If you were to get a check that was handed to you on the day that session began, but before the bell rang, you would still use that date, and that won't be an issue for our auditors. So again, just try to document everything as best you can about when you received it, and everything should be good.
May I purchase a new computer with campaign funds? I intend to use it primarily for legislative and campaign work.
To answering that question, Director Purcell, is the use of the word primarily. Remember, I previously talked about using funds in your campaign account. You cannot use those for personal use at all. They can only be used for office holder duties or to help in the campaign. So if you want to purchase a computer using campaign funds, that computer has to be used exclusively for either campaign work or office holder duties. So if you use it at all for personal use, you're going to have to document that. You're going to have to reimburse your campaign the fair market value of that use. We had a legislator ask this question, and she indicated she was going to kind of primarily use it for both, but she might use it for personal. And I told her, you could do that, but you have to document it. And I thought the documentation would be too extensive. As we say in the country, the squeeze wouldn't be worth the juice. So if you're going to buy a computer with campaign funds, you're going to have to document and keep records that you're using it exclusively for campaign or office holder duties. So you can do it, but remember, you got to have the documentation to back it up, and you cannot use that computer for personal use, or if you do, you need to reimburse your campaign account for the fair market value of that personal use.
My state-registered PAC occasionally contributes to local candidates. Does the PAC need to register with the County Election Commission, or the contribution was made?
Yes, the answer to that question is yes. Anytime a PAC gives money in a local election to a local official running for office or re-election, then yes, they do need to register not only with our office but also with the local election commission when they make that contribution. And they'll need to continue doing that for so long as they intend to continue making contributions in that local area. You can contact your local elections administrator to get some details about how they would close your account and how they want you to submit documentation. But in general, you need to keep that in mind, that you do have to file there and continue to file.
Can a legislator use his or her campaign account to purchase a gift for fellow legislators?
And the answer to that question, Director Purcell, is no. Again, as I previously stated, funds from a campaign account can only be used for a campaign or for office holder purposes. We have opined that it's hard to see how buying a gift for a fellow legislator would fit either one of those purposes. It's certainly not a campaign. That legislator is not in your district. And secondly, it's not an office holder expense. You're not required as an office holder to buy gifts for your fellow members. Having said that, if you have a leadership PAC, however, those restrictions on personal use don't apply to a PAC. A PAC has very few restrictions on how it can use its funds. So if you have a leadership PAC and you want to buy gifts for other members of the General Assembly, presumably you're buying those to build a better rapport with your members, or to if you're a caucus chair or you're chair of a committee, you're using those funds to say, hey, good work, we've worked well together this session. As a token of appreciation, I'm going to give you a gift. You can do that from your leadership PAC. The only caveat I would have here, and you can do it, be careful with the perception issue. Don't let those gifts get out of control where you're passing significant gifts among each other. It's not, again, not prohibited from the leadership PAC, but I would urge you to watch the perception issue there. But you can do it from a leadership PAC, and I can understand why those who have leadership PACs might be wanting to do that to build rapport with the fellow members.
How long is an appointment of treasurer statement effective?
So your appointment of treasurer form that's going to be filed with us at the beginning of each cycle is good for purposes of both the primary and the general election, as well as any runoff elections that might come up. As far as after the election, how good is it good for, or how long is it good for? I would encourage you that when you begin raising money for your next cycle, for the next election, at that point in time, you need to file a new appointment of treasurer form for that cycle. So really the form is only good for each cycle, and each cycle it needs to be updated with new information. Or just let us know that you do intend to be a candidate in the next cycle. But as long as it's been filed, it would be good for any election, including both primary and general, during that cycle.
How long must campaign records be maintained?
Thank you, Director Purcell, for that one. Generally, under the statute, you're required to maintain your campaign records for 2 years after the impacted election. We encourage you to maintain them even a little longer than that. It's like me with the Internal Revenue Service when I do my taxes. I think I go back 10 years and retain those documents because I don't want to get in trouble with the IRS. Same thing here. We have audits of legislators. So the statute says 2 years after the election. I might even retain it for 3 years just in case you picked up on an audit. And, you know, make sure you've got those records in place. We've said it before and we'll say it again, and we're getting ready to end the question and answer here. Document, document, document. You can't keep enough records. If you come up with an audit or if someone questions what you're doing on your campaign financial statement, you're going to need those records to verify what is correct there. So please document everything in sight. The other piece of advice I would give you, and perhaps not as important for General Assembly members as for candidates themselves, make sure your information is current with us. We rely on that information to send you notices. If you're late on a campaign finance statement, we are required to bring those to the Registry Board's attention and we'll give you notice. We rely on the notice that you filed with us. So if you need to update your address or phone number or email, do that with us. Make sure all your information is up to date and correct so that you will get notice of anything we're doing regarding either your campaign finance statement or your statements of interest. So again, keep those up to date. We've reached the end of our ethics training today. Thank you again for your attention to that training. I want to thank General Counsel Topping to my left. I appreciate her taking the load off of me and doing the campaign finance part of this presentation. I also want to thank Assistant Director Forsell, who's off camera, for those interesting questions, and I hope the answers to those were informative to you. I also want to thank Doug Himes for helping us put this together. He has been great to work with, and we look forward to continuing to work with him during this session and beyond. Next year, our hope is that we will be able to present live to you that COVID-19 will be a thing of the past, that we will all have been vaccinated with shots in our arm and be protected from it, and we can look at the pandemic as history and not something we have to currently worry about. Again, I will end this presentation as a beginning. If you have any questions for us, please let us know. We're there to assist you, and I wish you the best of luck and appreciate all each and every one of you do for the citizens of this state and for the state of Tennessee. Thank you very much, and I'm sure I'll see you before next year, but hopefully I'll see you next year live. Take care.